Native building traditions in the Iberian Peninsula were simple in form yet remarkably durable, and they changed very little throughout the entire Roman period. Archaeological excavations have revealed numerous prehistoric settlements, some likely dating back to the late Neolithic or early Bronze Age. One of the clearest examples lies at Ifere in southeastern Spain. Here, houses were tightly grouped on a hilltop protected by steep natural slopes and a surrounding wall. Traces of stairways still survive, while the walls were built from small, irregular stones, bonded with mud or clay. Floors were made of compacted earth, and the roofs were flat, constructed from reeds and branches tied together with esparto grass and sealed beneath a layer of mud. Tools made from jagged flint, grinding stones and ovens have been uncovered, along with later finds such as bracelets and ivory ornaments, indicating a society that had reached a relatively advanced level of material culture. Nearby tombs contained cremation urns, along with flint blades, arrowheads, and axes. Another major settlement at Sitania in the northwestern region reveals the foundations of around 40 round or square huts, enclosed within concentric defensive walls, built in massive stone blocks. These fortifications crown a hill accessed by roads, converging from all directions, suggesting its importance as a regional centre. Inscriptions, roof tiles, pottery, glassware, bronze objects, and coins from the early imperial period demonstrate that these hilltop strongholds continued to be inhabited long after Roman rule was established. Similar fortified towns have been identified across Andalusia, Portugal, Galicia, and other provinces. Many were laid out along organised streets lined with multi-room houses, often including wells. Castella de las Gracias in Albacete stretches nearly half a mile along a ridge, while Arcabriga, located between Madrid and Zaragoza, occupies a sloping terrain protected by double and even triple defensive walls. The settlement had 3 gates, one reinforced with towers, and was built across 3 terraced levels connected by steps. The nature of its houses shows that it remained occupied well into the Roman era. At Numantia, excavations have also uncovered clear remains of the Roman siege works, constructed during the campaign led by Scipio. Even settlements built on open plains were not without defences. Most included a fortified tower or refuge positioned to command wide views of the surrounding landscape. These structures allowed inhabitants to withdraw during attacks and also served as signal stations, using beacon fires to communicate across long distances. Some of these towers, originally built by Carthaginian forces, were later adapted for use as lighthouses. Domestic architecture in Spain relied heavily on rubble and earth packed tightly between wooden forms, then coated with mud or brick. This technique proved more resistant to sun and rain than lime mortar or cut stone. Even city walls were often built from unmortared stones, reinforced with mud in the traditional manner. Surviving examples of this construction can still be seen at Emporias, where Greek settlers preserved Iberian walls. Such methods remained common even into the early medieval period. Roofs were typically covered with hard wooden shingles made from oak or juniper. The native populations of Spain showed limited architectural innovation. Roman influence, however, was established more thoroughly here than in many other provinces, and the blended Italian and Greek architectural style introduced by Rome endured well into the Middle Ages. Circuses, temples, aqueducts, theatres, amphitheatres, colonnaded squares, townhouses and villas were widespread and sometimes well preserved. Yet they cannot be considered uniquely local creations. Most surviving structures date from the reign of Trajan and the emperors who followed him, as relatively little remains from the early imperial period. Builders used stone alongside an exceptionally durable form of cement, while marble was employed sparingly, often imported from Africa due to the poor quality of northern Spanish stone. Smaller monuments, such as tombs, were occasionally carved from granite, porphyry, or agate. Among the most impressive Roman structures is the Great Bridge spanning the Tagus River, later known as Alcantara. Built during the reign of Trajan through the combined efforts of 11 municipalities, it consists of 6 identical arches made of precisely cut stone. Massive square piers support a roadway, wide enough to allow multiple vehicles to pass side by side. Nearby, an inscription placed by the architect Lacer celebrates the bridge as a work intended to endure for all ages. Other major remains include the circus at Italica, the theatre at Saguntum, the naval arena at Emerita, and the aqueducts of Segovia and Tarraco. Smaller monuments also survive, such as triumphal arches and towers from Trajan's reign, built either through public funding or private patronage. Several early churches in Spain originated from Roman temples that were later converted or from structures erected after Christianity became dominant. Recent discoveries of early sculpture in southern and southeastern Spain have sparked significant debate. These works show Greek and Punic influences but appear to belong to a distinct native artistic tradition dating to around the 5th century before Christ. This tradition likely reflects the high level of culture attributed to the Tartessian civilization. While less refined than classical Greek sculpture, these works emphasize elaborate jewelry, amulets, veils, and headdresses. Their style can seem surprisingly modern, at times approaching the exaggerated forms later seen in medieval art. A major group of such statues was found at Cerro de los Santos in Murcia, including numerous female figures interpreted as priestesses or dedicatory offerings associated with a solar sanctuary. Several hold ritual vessels linked to libation practices. The most famous example of this tradition is the Lady of Elche, a nearly life-sized sandstone bust discovered near ancient Ilici. Painted in multiple colours, it depicts a woman wearing a veil, a ceremonial headdress, and a richly ornamented diadem. Large, perforated discs project from either side of her face, from which hang tassels ending in acorn-shaped pendants. A heavy triple necklace decorated with pearl-like beads and urn-shaped amulets completes the ensemble. A gold diadem from roughly the same period, discovered in western Spain, depicts embossed scenes of mounted and foot soldiers, servants bearing vessels, and symbolic animals rendered in a strikingly stylized manner. Early warrior statues have also been uncovered, showing figures adorned with heavy armlets and neck rings. One damaged example wears a short tunic, patterned with diamond shapes, a layered belt, a short sword, and a large round shield. Most native statues were carved from soft sandstone, allowing easy shaping but resulting in coarse outlines. Earlier idols are often extremely abstract, with barely defined limbs, and some were made simply from clay. Representations of gods appear to have been rare before Greek and Roman influence took hold. By contrast, sculptures produced in the Greco-Roman tradition are abundant and include depictions of gods, emperors, and prominent citizens. These works follow standard imperial styles and show little regional variation. Many fine examples come from emporiae, including statues of healing and love deities, as well as bronze reliefs. Dedications were often lavish, with inscriptions recording offerings of gold, silver, and precious stones. Wealthy individuals were buried with equal splendour in stone tombs or decorated sarcophagi, a practice that continued into the Christian period with biblical scenes replacing pagan imagery. Relief carvings reflect a blend of native and Roman influence, such as scenes of Iberian cavalry or battles between Roman and local forces. Eastern artistic traditions also left their mark. although little remains from Phoenician times beyond inscriptions and a few divine busts. Egyptian objects such as scarabs and ritual figures have been found across Spain. Sculptures linked to Eastern cults, including Isis, Ammon, and Mithras, appear at several sites, reflecting the cosmopolitan religious landscape of Roman Spain. Mosaic art flourished, particularly with mythological and symbolic themes. Scenes of chariot racing, gladiatorial combat, sacrifices, and legendary figures adorned villas and public buildings. By the early 4th century, however, both sculpture and mosaic declined in quality, giving way to simpler geometric designs made from artificial materials. Wall painting then rose to prominence, especially in churches, where symbolic figures drawn from both classical and Christian imagery filled the interiors. Ceramic production dates back to prehistoric times, with early vessels displaying polished black surfaces and mica inclusions. Burial grounds reveal large numbers of decorated urns, while later pottery shows floral and animal motifs influenced by Mediterranean styles. During Roman rule, pottery followed Italian models and was widely exported, especially durable wares from Saguntum marked with distinctive symbols. Metalwork survives in smaller quantities, though exceptional weapons from early Iberian culture reveal sophisticated craftsmanship. Roman-era metal objects include finely decorated silver bowls depicting mythological scenes, or ritual offerings associated with healing springs. Coin production was extensive, encompassing Greek, Punic, Iberian, and Roman issues. Greek-style coins circulated along the eastern coast. Punic types dominated southern ports, and native Iberian coinage spread across the interior. Roman colonial issues followed, eventually replaced by imperial coinage. Local minting ceased under Caligula, and Spain's distinct numismatic identity faded until the rise of post-Roman kingdoms. Reconstructing the native religions of ancient Spain is unusually difficult. The challenge is not only that the origins and relationships of the peninsula's many tribes remain uncertain, but also that political life was fragmented into countless small communities, and religious practice often followed those local boundaries. Nearly 100 divine names have survived in inscriptions and scattered references, and new ones still appear with fresh discoveries. Yet most of these gods mattered only within a narrow radius. Many were essentially sacred echoes of a place name, a mountain, a river, or a town, and only a handful seem to have been honoured across larger stretches of territory. The pattern is familiar even in later centuries, when villages built their identity around the cult of local martyrs, treasuring the bones of believers believed to have died in the persecutions of the 3rd and early 4th centuries, and placing them beneath the altar of a small shrine. The impulse is the same: faith anchored to a particular landscape and community. It is often claimed that Roman religion was quickly and completely absorbed, but that sweeping statement fits only certain regions, especially Baetica and the eastern coast. Under the Empire, one striking feature is how rarely dedications to standard Roman gods appear outside colonies and towns, where Italian soldiers, administrators, or settlers formed an influential presence. In those places, honouring Roman deities could serve as a public signal of loyalty. Elsewhere, where local populations dominated civic life, older protectors tended to survive under safer, more generalised labels. A community might honour the spirit of the town, a guardian deity, local household gods, or nymphs. Sometimes the result was a blended name that sounded Roman yet remained deeply local, pairing a familiar Roman figure with a regional epithet. At the same time, emperor worship often spread with real enthusiasm. Many communities treated the emperor not simply as a ruler, but as the living symbol of imperial power itself. Distance from Rome also helped sustain this devotion because the daily realities and political fatigue that could make the cult feel routine near the capital were less visible on the edge of the empire. In the south and east, where Roman religious forms were strongest, another shift unfolded. From roughly the age of Trajan onward, a wave of Eastern cults offered new rituals and promises that attracted many serious-minded worshippers. In several districts of Valencia and Murcia, the rites, centered on Isis, became especially prominent. The evidence for indigenous worship comes in three main forms. First, are scattered comments by ancient writers and geographers, many reflecting the world around the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ, when Greek travellers were particularly active. Second is the mass of inscriptions from the early imperial period, usually brief, naming a deity and the person making the dedication, often with a formula of thanks. Third are statues and votive gifts, though most belong to a period when Roman influence was already strong. Modern discussions frequently describe these native cults as Celtic, and a few major examples do seem to fit that influence, especially certain underworld and healing divinities, and a broad family of water powers. Still, the parallels with the religious worlds of Gaul and Britain are limited. The moon goddesses so widely honoured in Spain, and later appearing under imperial titles, do not match what is known from Celtic mythology farther north. It also matters that Druidism, which shaped Celtic religion into a distinct system, did not exist in Gaul at the time. Celtic groups began pressing into Spain around the 6th century before Christ. Ancient literary hints provide a first glimpse. In the southwest, star and sky worship was described as widespread among the Tartessian peoples. In one Roman veteran colony on a tributary of the Batis, a sun deity called Neton was said to have been honoured in the form of an idol with a radiating head and identified with Mars. The report comes from a late source, and it is possible that the outward appearance of the cult had already absorbed features from Eastern solar worship that flourished under the empire. Inscriptions show the name in several areas, including the northwest and regions near Emmerita. Some writers connect this god to an Irish war deity, whose name is similar, but that link is uncertain, and it is safer to treat the Spanish figure as native. In the far south, Saturn appears as an object of reverence, perhaps standing in for an earlier solar god. Much has happened in parts of Roman Africa. In western Baetica, a sanctuary honoured a goddess of the dawn. Mercury too appears strongly in the south, likely replacing an older local or Punic power. A hill near Carthago Nova was sacred to him, and he was remembered as a protector of fishermen. He even appears on local coinage, sometimes with the winged cap, sometimes represented by the staff of a herald. In central Spain, the Celtiberians were reported to offer sacrifices to an unnamed god before the gates of a town, while families performed religious dances by household under the full moon. The god in this case may have been another solar or lunar power. Elsewhere, armed dances were noted, with men clashing shields as part of the rite. Such scenes point to a deeper pattern. Ecstatic religion expressed through rapid movement, rhythm, and continuous sound. Traits that many observers have long associated with the Spanish temperament. Even in later periods, travellers noticed ceremonial dances performed in major churches, on festival days, combining devotion with choreographed movement before the altar. Some northern groups were described as atheists by a Greek writer, likely meaning not that they denied divinity, but that their gods did not match any familiar figures from Greek tradition. These peoples were said to practice wailing chants and to excel at divination. Reading signs in the entrails of animals, the flight of birds, and the behaviour of fire. Western tribes were portrayed as deeply committed to sacrifice. They consulted omens taken from veins and lungs, sometimes without removing the organs. and captives could be used in grim rituals. In some accounts, even the right hands of captives were offered to the gods. A war god received sacrifices of horses and goats, and in certain cases human victims as well, dressed in ceremonial cloaks. When the great leader Viriathus died, his body was placed on a high pyre. Sacrifices were offered, and then horsemen and infantry ran in circles around the flames, chanting praise. The vigil continued until the fire burned out, and the rite ended with ritual combat that resembled gladiatorial fighting. Accounts also describe memorial practices around warrior tombs, with upright stones set up in numbers matching the enemies a man had killed. Even if the explanation offered by later writers is doubtful, the basic fact of standing stones as sacred markers fits the wider Mediterranean world, where such stones often functioned as religious symbols. At Cape St. Vincent, a heap of stones was believed to be specially holy and protected by a solar power. It was considered dangerous to approach at night, when divine presences were thought to move through the place. Reverence for stones may have been inherited from much older builders of dolmens and megalithic tombs, shaping both Iberian and Celtic traditions. These fragments suggest a religious landscape that was highly impressionable, mystical, and open to claims of supernatural authority. Roman commanders exploited this atmosphere. Sertorius famously kept a tame deer and claimed it carried divine messages that guided his decisions. A Celtic leader named Olindicus possessed a silver spear said to have fallen from the sky, a dramatic object meant to validate his authority. Much later, a young visionary gathered followers by presenting himself, through signs and omens, as a messianic figure. Diviners and prophets flourished in such conditions. Some northern peoples were known for reading omens in birds. Military leaders sometimes found their armies saturated with sorcerers and wizards who undermined discipline. Other Roman figures encountered prophets who offered encouragement to ambitious plans. In one Spanish city, an altar was even restored in the early 3rd century to the legendary enchantress. A culture that tolerated magic also provided fertile soil for mystical systems such as Gnostic belief. Christian leaders later struggled to suppress older customs that persisted beneath new names. Rites meant to purify harvests, offerings to sun and moon, reverence for animals and serpents, and other practices that blurred the line between folk religion and formal worship. Such accusations were often levelled against heretics, yet some ascetic movements fiercely denied them, insisting their spirituality had nothing to do with pagan magic. When inscriptions and archaeological finds from the imperial period are examined, a different picture appears from the crude rites described by earlier geographers. Native gods did not disappear, but their cults often gained temples and statues, and their identities were increasingly mapped onto the Greco-Roman pantheon. One of the most important Western deities was Endovelicus, honoured especially in what is now southern Portugal. Two major centres of the cult lay near modern towns in the Alentejo region. Although the Lusitanians were not purely Celtic, signs of Celtic mixture appear in that area, and the god's name is often explained through Celtic roots, meaning something like the very best. A notable dedication from one sanctuary was carved on a marble pedestal that once supported a statue and displays symbols such as a wreath, a palm, and a boar, an animal often linked to Celtic religious imagery. Several clues suggest that Endovelicus was an earth power connected with healing. In later centuries, a church dedicated to St. Michael, widely associated with protection and healing, rose on or beside the ruins of the pagan sanctuary, absorbing the old sacred site into a new religious framework. Excavations at another centre revealed a temple that remained important deep into the imperial age, with Latin inscriptions, statue fragments, and figures that may depict the god, including one youthful statue holding a bird. Another major cult in western and southern regions centered on a goddess often linked with Persephone. Her older name appears in several forms and seems to connect to an ancient root meaning mother. In many dedications, her name is paired with Persephone, and sometimes only the Roman name is used, even though the power being invoked was clearly local. A town identified as the main seat of her worship gave her an official title, emphasizing invincibility and local identity. This cult preserves one of the rare survivals of totem-like symbolism in Roman Spain. Small bronze goats have been found with their feet shaped into a base and dedicated to the goddess. They may have functioned as votive gifts, or perhaps as ornaments attached to weapons. The goat also appears as sacred in accounts of Lusitanian war worship. Across wide parts of the West, the pig held similar sacred value. Granite figures of pigs, roughly life-sized, appear in groups and were sometimes placed near graves. Even in the Roman army, regional identity persisted. When legionaries held ceremonies for the imperial eagle, auxiliary troops from the northwest might dedicate offerings to the boar that decorated their standards. Coins suggest that the bull served as an emblem for at least one major town. The underworld goddess associated with Persephone also carried a reputation for punishing wrongdoing. One remarkable inscription asks her, in solemn language, to avenge thefts committed against a female devotee, listing missing garments in careful detail, from tunics to linen wraps and an undergarment. Other deities appear in clusters and sometimes in plural form. A group known as the Lugoves seems related to the Celtic god Lugus, often linked with Mercury, and dedications to them appear in the northwest and central regions. One altar includes 3 triangular hollows for incense, implying a triple divinity. Their name may connect to woodland sanctuaries, echoing the Latin word for sacred groves. Additional gods included Arnus, apparently connected with victory and perhaps merged with Mars, and Trebaruna, paired closely with Victoria, sometimes with altars dedicated side by the same worshipper. The horse goddess Epona, known across the Celtic world and even at Rome, appears in a few Spanish offerings, including one altar decorated with a chariot. Alongside these named gods stood a vast realm of spirits, tied to water and place. Fairy-like mothers were honoured in the north and west, echoing traditions found across Celtic regions. Closely related were nymphs presiding over streams and healing springs, often believed to appear in dreams and demand a monument or offering. Later, folklore preserves similar beings. The Xanas of the Asturian mountains, imagined as small figures living beneath remote fountains, washing white garments at midnight, rewarding the honest and dragging the wicked beneath the water. Or in Portugal, enchanted women associated with ruins and lonely springs. Many such cults were later redirected toward Christian figures, with chapels built beside the same sacred waters. Dreams played a broader role as well. Not only could nymphs and gods appear, but the dead themselves were believed to return in visions, asking relatives to set up memorials or offerings. Inscriptions even record such requests. Some monuments suggest fascination with gateways of dreams described in classical poetry, while others carry symbols linking the underworld, serpents, and springheads. Altars might be raised to a god explicitly in honour of a deceased person, blending devotion and memory. Burial practice varied widely, from rough trenches covered with stones to elaborate Roman mausolea. Many Iberian groups preferred cremation, while peoples with Celtic roots and some southern communities also practiced burial. In remote areas, bodies might even be left for animals and birds. Across tombstones and native monuments, recurring sacred symbols appear, often tied to sky worship, discs and crescents, sometimes paired with doves. Other signs include the swastika in several forms, 6 rayed stars, tridents, anchors, and even bridge motifs, symbolizing the soul's passage toward the heavens. Graves contained practical and precious objects across the centuries, from stone axes and flint knives to Roman glass cups, painted pottery, and jewelry. Inscriptions frequently include prayers for peace and rest, sometimes expressed in striking lines asking the powers below not to begrudge the dead their place, their name, or even a light covering of soil. Amulets were common. A small bronze head of a radiated sun god was found near one site, and statues are shown wearing similar solar emblems, combined with the crescent of the moon. Along the western coast, a type of stone believed to protect against lightning was recovered. Around Numantia, long regarded as a significant centre before Roman rule, pottery fragments carry swastikas and animal symbols that look like talismans. Rings and carved stones marked with Gnostic emblems appear frequently, reflecting the mixture of beliefs circulating under the empire. In such an environment, the Christian cross could naturally be treated, not only as a symbol of faith, but also as protection against spirits and unseen dangers. Official Roman worship existed, but its footprint was uneven. Capitoline temples are known in some major cities, yet the standard triad was honoured mainly by officials and soldiers. Jupiter appears in many dedications and sometimes carries unfamiliar local titles, hinting that worshippers were mapping him onto older, indigenous powers. Mars likewise receives regional surnames, and the names of dedicators often suggest local origin rather than Roman identity. Minerva attracted devotion from artisans and craft workers, with professional groups placing themselves under her protection. Dedications to Asclepius and Venus often came from Greek communities, and some inscriptions preserve unusual Greek terms, used to describe statue adornment and ritual vessels. While the official cults advanced slowly, emperor worship grew rapidly in major centres. Augustus spent significant time in Spain and became associated in local memory with pacification and stability. An altar was raised to him at Tarraco during his lifetime, and after his death, the provincials pressed to build a full temple nearby, a model adopted in other provinces as well. These temples became gathering points for provincial councils. Over time, additional emperors were included, and towns appointed priests for the deified rulers, sometimes linking the cult to Rome itself and to the living emperor. Such devotion was not purely imposed from above. It was encouraged because it reinforced the authority of imperial decisions and gave distant populations a tangible image of central power. Greek and Punic cults under Roman rule effectively narrowed to a few dominant shrines. Near a Greek settlement on the eastern coast stood a major sanctuary of Artemis in her Ephesian form, known to Romans as Diana of Dianium. As patroness of the Greek colonies, she remained widely revered among both Greek settlers and neighbouring Iberian peoples. During the civil conflicts of the late Republic, rebels used the temple as an arsenal, and its importance endured for centuries, though later writers describe the surrounding district as falling into desolation. On the southern coast, certain sanctuaries of Juno appear to continue earlier, Punic centres devoted to Astarte. The same goddess, reintroduced from Africa under a new title, appears again in later centuries in major towns. Above all, the shrine of Hercules Melkarth at Gades remained a major religious focus for Romans and natives alike. Prominent Romans made vows there, and costly sacrifices continued in Phoenician style, even well into the imperial period. As late as the early 3rd century, a Roman governor was executed for consulting the oracle maintained at the site. Worship of Hercules in this local form also spread to other towns. Many temples flourished during the Antonine period, though earlier shrines appear on local coinage in several major cities. Some sanctuaries were famous, dedicated to Diana, to the sun and moon, or to Concord, while more modest rural shrines also existed. In at least one case, remains of a rustic sanctuary, decorated with hunting reliefs, suggest an early date, perhaps even before the Augustan age. Eastern cults moving westward from Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt left visible traces in Spain. Though outside the rites of Isis, they seem less deeply rooted among native communities. Cybele, the Earth Mother from Asia, received some dedications. In one city, a guild associated with her and with Attis existed, blending civic roles with ritual identity. A Greek woman in Lisbon made an offering connected with specialized rites involving sacred vessels. A small number of inscriptions commemorate the taurobolium, the solemn sacrifice in which a bull was offered, and the worshipper was ritually sprinkled with blood. One wealthy woman celebrated her birthday in this way, under the direction of the cult's leading priest. Another taurobolium was performed for the safety of an emperor, who had favoured a city, and in that ceremony a priestess of Isis supplied the ram offered to Attis. Cybele and Isis often stood together, sometimes sharing sanctuaries, and Isis could even receive titles identifying her as a mother of the gods. Isis herself became one of the most influential foreign deities in Spain. Her worship, linked with Serapis, Horus, Ammon and others, spread widely in large towns and was especially popular among women. The appeal lay in ritual splendor, purification, and the rhythm of daily prayer. In some contexts, Jupiter was linked with Ammon or Serapis, and the cult of Isis could be associated with devotion to Rome and Augustus. Spain's close ties with Africa helped this spread, and Isiac symbols appear frequently in Spanish material culture. Artifacts include lamps decorated with Egyptian figures and sculptures of Ammon, as a ram placed atop tomb monuments. Isis also served as patroness of slave associations in some cities. In one colony, she appears under a title connecting her with the protection of young women. One dedication describes an ornate statue of Isis covered in jewels, set up by a woman in memory of a granddaughter, transforming private grief into public devotion. Mithraism, a mystery cult built around a Persian ideal of virtue, truth, and light, was above all a religion of soldiers. In Spain, it never became as common as it did in frontier zones of the empire, largely because relatively few legionary units from distant provinces were stationed there for long periods. Even so, traces of the cult appear in several major cities. Inscriptions and dedications to Mithras, sometimes using honorific titles that emphasize his invincible power, have been found at Emerita, Malacca, Tarraco, Italica, and a handful of other sites. Most of these dedications are tied to military men or people closely attached to military life, which fits the broader pattern seen across the Roman world. Emerita seems to have housed a true centre of Mithraic worship. Evidence points to a sanctuary built in the traditional style of the cult, a space designed to resemble a cave located to the east of the town. By the middle of the 2nd century, the community there was organised enough to have a senior ritual leader, and one dedication records a figure connected with the 7th Legion, setting up an altar to mark the birthday of the invincible god. This is the kind of formal, calendar-based observance expected in Mithraic circles, where sacred meals, grades of initiation, and tightly structured ceremonies played a central role. The spread of Mithraism into the western provinces was strengthened by Roman campaigns in the east, and the reign of Trajan, with its long military presence beyond the Mediterranean, likely helped carry Mithraic practices along the routes of soldiers, administrators, and camp followers. Later, Another Eastern movement reached Spain and left a different kind of footprint. The Basilidean form of Gnosticism, whose earliest roots lay far to the east before the Christian era, travelled westward through Syria and Egypt, and absorbed elements from multiple traditions along the way. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, it had gained real influence in parts of Spain, especially in the west and the north. Christian writers portrayed its advance in dramatic language, describing it as sweeping across the land from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic. The worldview it carried was stark. True knowledge was said to come not from public rites or civic cults, but from inner awakening. The universe was explained through secret names and formulas, and the enlightened person was imagined as someone who possessed the correct words of power and understood the hidden structure of reality. Material existence was treated as a fallen state, a weakening of spirit into substance, and the goal of life was described as a return upward toward the original source, a supreme principle that emanated lesser powers and, at certain moments, sent a saving figure into the world. Spain does not preserve many detailed written accounts describing how these doctrines played out in daily life. Yet the material evidence is hard to ignore. Amulets, engraved stones and rings appear from time to time, with a notable concentration in the region around Asturica. Some carry striking formulas that fuse divine names from different traditions into a single claim of unity. One ring declares that Zeus, Serapis, and a mysterious power called Iao are one, collapsing Greek and Egyptian divine language into a single Gnostic statement. Another, shaped with multiple faces, bears Greek letters arranged to express a sacred title connected with wisdom and cosmic origins. A carved stone shows a ritual candelabrum accompanied by the sun and moon and 5 visible planets, forming a 7-fold pattern that reflects an older Eastern astronomical sacred number. Finds like these suggest a spiritual marketplace where older Mediterranean gods, Eastern cosmic symbolism, and new religious ideas blended into private protective objects, meant to be worn on the body. From religion and mystery cults, the story shifts into the urban landscape of Spain itself, and into a city whose identity was shaped by Punic power before Rome made it its own. New Carthage was among the last major Punic foundations in the peninsula. It is associated with Hasdrubal, linked by marriage to the Barca family, and it was planted in a position chosen for strength. The settlement rose on a hill, with only a narrow stretch of flat ground separating it from the head of a gulf that formed a natural harbour. An island helped shield the anchorage. To the north lay fertile valleys associated with the Iberian Contestani. To the south and west, mountains pressed close, creating a landscape both defensible and contained. The site was designed with military logic. Its natural strength made it an ideal arsenal, and its location, close to the routes crossing from Africa, meant it could serve as the main landing point for reinforcements. It also functioned as an export hub for agricultural produce and mineral wealth, funneling goods back toward the Punic heartland. When Scipio captured the city during the Second Punic War, it did not lose its strategic role. Instead, it became a major administrative centre for Roman Spain, at least in the early period. Although Tarraco later overtook it in prestige, New Carthage remained a frequent winter residence for Roman governors and the head of a major judicial district. Dozens of towns were tied to it through legal administration, bringing petitions and cases to its courts. Its connectivity reinforced this importance. A major state road linked it outward toward Gaul and Italy, and its harbour was among the best on Spain's Mediterranean coast. It also sat near famous silver mines that, in earlier centuries, were said to produce an extraordinary daily yield. Even after that silver wealth declined, the city remained an important trading exchange positioned between sea routes and the internal markets of the peninsula. The survival of a relatively large number of republican inscriptions from this city is a sign of its early significance, since few other Spanish towns preserve so much epigraphic evidence from that period. Formal colonial rank arrived later, when the city received a new Roman name and status. But Italian residents were likely present long before, dating from the generation of Roman conquest. A small Punic element also persisted. Dedications to Hercules in his local form appear, and some personal names in the inscriptions still point toward older Phoenician connections. The landscape around the city supported industries that tied it tightly to the Mediterranean economy. Nearby hills were thick with esparto grass, cultivated on a large scale since Punic times. This crop became so strongly associated with the region that it influenced later names for the area. Another major industry was fishing and the preservation of fish, especially the mackerel that swarmed near the harbour. The nearby island even acquired a name reflecting this abundance, and the people who worked the sea organised themselves into a professional association, much like the fishing guilds known from the port towns of Italy. Ancient authors describe a Punic sanctuary on a high promontory dedicated to a healing god identified by Greeks and Romans, with Asclepius, while another hill held the residence built by Hasdrubal, functioning as a palace or governor's seat. Under Roman rule, the city was fortified with strong walls, and it developed a dense set of public buildings. A round amphitheatre with multiple tiers of seating has been explored in modern excavations, and traces of painted decoration were found on its walls. Excavators also brought to light parts of the forum buried deep below later levels, including a marble pavement laid in large blocks without mortar, along with reliefs, statues and column bases. Among older monuments, one structure stands out for its unusual design. A tall, pyramidal tower built as a commemorative work connected with Scipio. It rises more than 40 feet on a heavy pedestal and is constructed in a checker pattern of dark and light stone. Local tradition later gave it a nickname based on its sealed appearance, since it lacks doors and windows, turning it into a kind of silent landmark, rather than a usable building. The city's coinage began under Augustus and did not last long, but it is varied enough to show what mattered to the local authorities. Many coins carry the emperor's portrait, while the reverse imagery draws on priestly and civic symbols, including ritual implements, olive branches, and temple facades that point to the municipal cult of the ruler. Some issues even include the names of North African royal figures who held honorary civic office in the town, a reminder of how closely Spain's southeast remained linked to Africa by trade, movement, and politics. Eastern cults also found receptive ground here. One inscription refers to a festival of Cybele, featuring dances and celebrated under municipal authority. In the surrounding area, statues of Apis and other Egyptian gods have been recovered, and the coin imagery sometimes displays unmistakably Isiac symbols, merging local civic identity with the broader religious fashions of the empire. Yet despite these advantages, the city's prominence faded over time. It did not sit at the heart of the later imperial road network, and inscriptions from the 2nd and 3rd centuries become relatively scarce. Administrative reforms in the late empire briefly restored its importance when it became the head of a province once again. But violent disruption followed. In the 5th century, it suffered heavily during Vandal incursions. Later, rebuilding occurred under Byzantine control, only for the city to be destroyed again in the 7th century. And its next true revival came after the Arab conquest reshaped the political map of the region. From this declining harbour city, attention turns inland to Cordoba, a place whose story combines military settlement, political turbulence, and a striking rise in cultural prestige. Cordoba began as a town of the Turdoli and stood on a hill above the Deities at the point where the river first became navigable. This location gave it immediate strategic and commercial value, linking inland routes with river traffic moving toward the coast. It was among the earliest Spanish cities to undergo deep Romanization, and veterans were settled there in the 2nd century before Christ. The city also faced war early in its Roman period, resisting attacks from Western raiders, and later it was drawn into the bitter rivalries of the late Republic. Its political instincts tended toward the aristocratic side. In one episode, a Roman commander celebrated an inflated triumph there after a minor success, staging public displays of victory that later observers treated with open irony. During the civil wars, Corduba backed the losing side against Caesar, then endured harsh governance under a Roman official whose rule became notorious. When power shifted again, the city suffered a massacre carried out by the victors. These shocks did not erase the community, but they shaped its civic memory and sharpened its local pride. By the 1st century before Christ, Cordoba had also become one of the intellectual centres of Roman Spain. Poets and rhetoricians were active, and by the age of Augustus, the city could sustain serious literary education. Within a relatively short span, it produced a remarkable concentration of writers, teachers, and public speakers. Figures whose careers showed that provincial Spain could compete culturally with older Mediterranean centres. That reputation for learning created a long echo in later centuries, when Islamic Cordoba would become famous as a beacon of scholarship in a darker age. The citizens also carried a strong local patriotism well into the period of decline, displayed dramatically when the city resisted a Visigothic king with unusual determination. Roman elites found the region attractive. Country estates spread through the suburbs, and wealthy owners treated the area as a fashionable seasonal retreat. The most imposing buildings lay in the southern district, and several temples were built in richly coloured stone. One sanctuary, dedicated to Janus, later gave its site to the great mosque that would become the architectural symbol of Moorish Cordoba. Little survives above ground from the Roman city, partly because later destruction and rebuilding reused or removed older materials. The mosque itself incorporated many Roman columns of coloured marble. A bridge across the Guadalquivir preserves Roman foundations and buttresses, and the remains of an aqueduct show how water was carried from hills miles away. Segments of the ancient walls and the defensive ditch are still traceable. Excavations have revealed parts of a major administrative complex once used for legal business, including stairs made from expensive red and yellow marble. The amphitheatre is mostly lost, but scattered architectural fragments continue to appear: column drums, carved garlands, a black marble well head, and small bronze figures with Egyptian themes. The city's coins belong mainly to the reign of Augustus and display high artistic quality. Common types include Venus on one side and Cupid on the other, holding symbols of fertility and prosperity. Other issues show military standards and priestly emblems, and many carry a legend indicating that the coinage was struck with imperial permission. Cordoba's economy remained strong for centuries, supported by fertile land, access by river and road, nearby mining districts, and trade in famous wool and olive oil prized across the empire. Later references become thinner after the 1st century as Hispalis rose in importance, perhaps because the mines near Cordoba declined and the rival city's access to seaborne trade proved more advantageous. Christian life eventually became visible in the historical record, with the city gaining a notable church and producing many martyrs during the persecutions of the early 4th century. Its bishop later appears among the leaders who signed important church decisions in Spain, suggesting that the community had become organized and influential by the time imperial persecution gave way to imperial patronage. Emerita, another key city of Roman Spain, followed a different path. Founded as a military colony under Augustus in the late 1st century before Christ, it was placed on a low hill by the Anas River in a position that linked provinces and routes. Veterans from 2 legions formed the nucleus of the settlement. The intention was not simply to build a fortress, but to spread Roman customs and develop a region that had been thinly populated. Over time, the colony evolved into a major commercial and administrative centre. Traders, immigrants, and specialists arrived, including Greeks, Italians, and Africans, and inscriptions reveal a lively world of professions and beliefs. The landscape remained productive, known for olives, dyes, and a rich agricultural base. The city's Roman remains are exceptionally rich because later centuries did not bury it under continuous urban expansion. Bridges, aqueducts, theatres, and entertainment complexes still trace the outlines of an imperial city built with confidence. Its religious life was equally varied, with dedications ranging from Roman state gods to local and Eastern cults. Christianity eventually took root strongly as well, and local devotion to a famous martyr turned the city into a place of pilgrimage. Legends grew around her shrine, describing signs in nature that marked anniversaries and promised prosperity. And these stories helped protect the city's monuments in later conquests, by wrapping the old stone in sacred meaning. Farther south, on the Atlantic edge, the story reaches the ancient island city of Gades, whose foundation was tied to Phoenician expansion and the pull of the Western Sea. Tradition describes settlers from Tyre guided by an oracle to the region near the Pillars of Hercules. Early attempts to establish themselves failed, first along the coast east of the straits, then on an island nearer the entrance, perhaps because local resistance was too strong. A later expedition pushed farther west and occupied a long, narrow island in Tartessian territory, close to the mouth of a river branch that has since shifted and dried. This settlement was established in an era so early that it predates the foundation of Carthage and even stands alongside the oldest Phoenician colonies of the Western Mediterranean. An attempt by Etruscans to gain a foothold in the region was driven off, and the Gaditans went on to build a powerful export economy, turning their position at the ocean's threshold into a lasting source of wealth and influence. After the Carthaginians took control, Gades slipped into a quieter phase. Yet its brightest era may actually have come early under Roman influence. During the Second Punic War, the city aligned itself with Rome through diplomacy rather than conquest. In 212 BC, Lucius Marcius, a senior centurion who stepped forward after the deaths of the Scipio commanders, secured a formal friendship with Gades. When the war ended, the Gaditans argued that they had never been subdued by Roman arms and therefore deserved to remain free. The Roman Senate accepted that claim, and Gades entered the Roman system with an unusual status and a strong sense of autonomy. In 78 BC, the relationship was set down in a formal treaty, confirmed at Rome, and it included strict rules designed to keep the two communities distinct. Even citizenship could not be exchanged casually. No one from either side was meant to become a citizen of the other, unless the original community approved it through its own public assembly. Around this period, Gades also became the administrative head of a legal district, drawing surrounding towns into its orbit for judicial business. Julius Caesar's connection with the city gave its story a sharper Roman edge. As a young official, he visited Gades, and was remembered for a dream that later writers treated as prophetic. A private scene that was interpreted as a sign of future supremacy in Roman politics. Later, as a senior magistrate, he pushed the city further toward Roman municipal habits. Gades had long been governed by its own traditional magistrates, and many older practices still reflected Punic law and custom. Caesar introduced a more Roman civic framework, not by flooding the place with Italian colonists, but by reshaping local governance. During the Civil War, the city paid a heavy price. A Pompeian commander stripped sacred wealth from temples, and the humiliation left a scar. After Caesar's victory in Spain, the treasure was restored, and the city received municipal rights. An important turning point because it showed Rome granting a full civic upgrade to a non-Italian community without needing to transplant a new population to make it Roman. Under Caesar, the city was given an honorific title. Under Augustus, its status was reinforced again, and its civic identity became openly tied to the new imperial order. By then, Gades had already absorbed much of the Atlantic commerce once dominated by Carthage, especially after Carthage's destruction in 146 BC. Greeks arrived in significant numbers, drawn by profits and maritime networks, and the city's harbour culture became a meeting place of languages and trading styles. Even in the early empire, Gades held on to a remarkable share of the Atlantic trade connecting Europe and Africa. Wealthy ship owners launched large ocean-going vessels, while smaller operators used lighter craft nicknamed horses, a reference to a Phoenician symbol painted on prows. These boats pushed south along the African coastline on fishing and trading journeys, reaching far beyond the familiar Mediterranean circuits. To the north, they ranged toward Gaul and Britain, linking the outer seas to Roman demand. Rome itself remained a constant market. Grain, salted fish, and goods brought in from the African coast circulated through Gadetan hands, and the city's richest merchants became visible across the Mediterranean world. Ancient writers like to tell stories that captured this restless mobility. A citizen travelling all the way to Italy simply to see a famous historian, or silver vessels bearing Gadetan names turning up at an Etrurian spa, likely left as thank offerings after a cure. Yet the reputation of Gades was not only commercial. Romans often imagined it as a place of polished pleasure and expensive habits, the kind of luxury that outsiders associated with the Eastern Mediterranean and with long-standing Semitic traditions. Performers travelled from Gades to Italy in large numbers, especially dancers and castanet players, feeding Roman appetite for exotic entertainment. The city was celebrated for music, particularly the festive and flirtatious styles that Roman poets loved to hint at. Even later, nicknames given to the city, titles implying joyfulness and wit, echo an older image already circulating in the imperial age. The urban shape of Gades reinforced this character. The original settlement on the island was compact and functioned less like a dense residential metropolis, and more like a nerve centre for politics, contracts, and shipping. Many citizens spent long stretches at sea. Others lived or worked across the channel on the mainland, where broad estates and unusually rich pasture lands supported the city's elite. By the time of the Augustan census, Gades was said to contain one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the empire. The number of equestrians, a social rank tied to property and status, was astonishingly high, rivaled in Italy only by Rome and one or two exceptional cities. Holding civic office there became a public honour, even for foreign royalty. A North African king accepted the role of senior magistrate in the city as a distinction, an act that revealed how far Gadetan prestige could travel. When ancient authors listed the city's notable buildings, 3 sites, repeatedly surfaced. Across the water on the mainland stood an arsenal built through the fortune of a leading citizen, designed to speed the construction and fitting out of merchant fleets. Near the city itself rose a temple of Baal Saturn. At the far end of the island stood the great sanctuary of Melkarth, the Phoenician Hercules, a place wrapped in stories that fascinated visitors. In that temple, the god was not represented by a statue in the usual Greco-Roman style. Instead, two bronze pillars stood as the central objects of awe, and they were treated by some as the true Pillars of Hercules, rivaling the famous cliffs at the Straits. The sanctuary was also linked to wonders, wells that seemed to rise and fall in ways that defied the tides, and a strange tree with drooping branches and long, blade-like leaves. Legends claimed that if a branch was snapped, it bled milk, and that cutting the roots released a vermilion fluid, imagined as the blood of a monster buried beneath. Ritual rules added to the atmosphere. Women were excluded from the inner space. Worshippers wore white linen, offered incense without belts, went barefoot, kept their hair closely cropped, and maintained a perpetual fire on the hearth. The sacrifices offered there were described as unusually splendid, and the endurance of the building's timber was treated as a miracle in itself. The god's protection was also woven into heroic tales. One story described an attack by a local king named Theron, with a naval battle unfolding offshore. In the middle of the fight, fire broke out among the Tartessian ships, and survivors later claimed they had seen lions standing on the prows of the Phoenician vessels. At the same time, rays of light appeared to strike and consume the enemy fleet, like the radiant lines artists drew around the heads of solar gods. In the city's imagination, divine favour and maritime victory belonged together. Even the civic landscape carried symbolic altars, dedicated not only to major gods, but to abstract forces, old age, poverty, artistic skill, the year and the month, suggesting a worldview in which every rhythm of life had a spiritual address. Greek travellers, thrilled by the unfamiliar Atlantic environment, layered the city with further marvels. People were said to sing hymns to death. The dying were imagined as unable to pass away when the tide was full, needing submarine winds to loosen the spirit. Nightfall and sunrise were described as arriving with dramatic suddenness. Such claims reveal less about physical reality than about the Mediterranean mindset encountering tides and oceanic scale, phenomena that never ceased to astonish those raised on calmer inland seas. Over time, however, Gades began to lose its commercial advantage. New harbours on the Mediterranean coast pulled traffic eastward, closer to Italy and to the empire's main routes. Roads improved, and regions once reached most easily by ship could now be approached overland. Atlantic dominance no longer guaranteed centrality. The city never became a bishop's seat, and ecclesiastical authority in the region centred elsewhere. By the eve of Visigothic power, it had already shrunk dramatically, its earlier status preserved more in memory and literature than in living institutions. Modern Gades, large and continuously inhabited, sits over much of the ancient footprint, and parts of the old shoreline have vanished beneath the sea. That is why Roman remains are scattered and fragmentary. An ancient bridge once linked the island to the mainland on a vast line of arches, though later rebuilding altered it heavily. Sections of a road leading inland toward Cordoba can still be traced, and remnants of an aqueduct survive, a reminder that the city once drew water from far away. At exceptionally low tides, foundations near the old sanctuary site have sometimes been glimpsed. Underground discoveries still occur: buried chambers, ornaments of gold, rings, necklaces, and occasionally anthropoid sarcophagi, shaped like human figures in a Phoenician style. The coins tell a parallel story. Earlier issues favour Hercules on the front, paired on the reverse with astronomical symbols, or fish, reflecting both religion and the sea. Under Rome, the head of Hercules remains, but imperial names are added, and naval imagery becomes common, including decorative stern emblems and, at times, a reference to the famous pillars of the temple. The city's cultural output was also remembered with pride. A philosopher associated with Pythagorean thought came from Gades, and poets of wide-ranging skill were celebrated by contemporaries. An agricultural writer whose work later became a classic belonged to the same milieu. Most famous of all were two men from a single family line, the Balbi, whose careers show how a Gaditan could move from Atlantic commerce into the core of Roman power. The elder, Balbus, once defended in court by Cicero, had been granted Roman citizenship through high-level patronage in recognition of service to the Roman state. Yet the legal foundations of that citizenship could be challenged if the proper approvals back home had not been secured, and political enemies tried to use that technical weakness against him. The case became a public test of status and legitimacy, and the acquittal preserved both Balbus's position and the city's influence. He later held senior roles in Caesar's military system, acquired property in Italy, cultivated learning, and moved comfortably among elite circles. Balbus eventually reached the highest civic honour in Rome itself, the first man of provincial origin to do so, and he invested heavily in public buildings and spectacles, leaving gifts to the Roman populace that matched the generosity expected of great patrons. The younger Balbus followed with an even more dramatic profile. He is remembered as the only provincial, aside from emperors, to celebrate a formal triumph. After success against desert peoples in North Africa, he governed key regions and returned benefits to his home city, expanding its infrastructure and even building a second settlement beside it. Like his uncle, he wrote and sponsored culture, including a historical drama drawn from episodes in his own life, staged for public entertainment at Gades. From there, the narrative reaches Italica, the earliest Roman veteran settlement in Spain, founded in 206 BC near Hispalis, on the western bank of the Deities. Over centuries, it evolved from a loosely organized community into a municipium, hosting more veterans and occasionally serving as a governor's residence. The city later became famous as the birthplace of emperors, above all Trajan and Hadrian, and it benefited from imperial favour. In late antiquity, it declined into near ruin, briefly revived for strategic reasons during Visigothic conflicts, and then faded again, leaving behind an amphitheatre and scattered architectural fragments, unearthed in fields. Tarraco, by contrast, rose as Rome's principal gateway to Spain. Perched high above the sea, it began as a native stronghold, then became the first major Roman base after the landing of Scipio in 218 BC. From there, Rome could push south and west while maintaining a coastal line toward Gaul. Colonial status and an engineered harbour made it the capital of the province, and its inscriptions far outnumber those of other Spanish towns, reflecting deep administrative life. Emperors wintered there, armies passed through, and the cult of Augustus took architectural form in a grand temple complex whose imagery spread onto local coinage. Tarraco exported wine, flax, and pottery, and built massive entertainment structures, a circus, amphitheatre, and theatre, along with aqueducts and monumental tombs. Yet even this city suffered in the 3rd century under raids and insecurity, losing commercial weight to rivals closer to the main entry routes into Spain, while the late imperial state gradually shifted its centres of gravity elsewhere. Tracing the literary wave that rose in Roman Spain is surprisingly difficult, not because the movement was small, but because the surviving evidence is uneven. What can be seen, however, is a pattern. In the age of Caesar and Augustus, a strong cultural current, takes shape in Baetica, later spreads into central and northern districts, and then fades early in the 2nd century. Spain often receives its first push from outside, ideas arriving through Rome and the wider Latin world. And when the conditions are right, the result is a quick flowering. The same pattern carries its own weakness. Once the first surge of fresh themes is spent, writers begin to compensate with technique. Language becomes sharper, more clever, more polished, and sometimes more strained. Thought becomes more delicate, more subtle, more intent on effect. Maturity arrives fast, and decline can arrive just as fast, not from a lack of talent, but from a kind of intellectual fatigue. Few families illustrate this arc more clearly than the 3 generations associated with the Aenean name. The father, who collects and judges the rhetoric of his era. The philosopher's son, who turns moral reflection into a public art. And the grandson, whose brilliance burns in a highly trained, highly pressurized style. There were many Spanish-born authors in this period, and at first glance they do not seem to share one uniform national stamp. Some write technical handbooks, some become so fully integrated into Roman culture that their origins almost disappear behind their Latin. Yet certain habits keep returning. One of the strongest is a taste for dramatization. Even when a work is not formally a play, the writer often tries to step aside and let scenes act themselves out through speeches, quick anecdotes, and vivid set pieces. Characters are sketched in a few bold strokes. Situations are made to flare into life as if the reader were watching rather than being told. This instinct survives even inside the rhetorical school culture of the early empire, a culture that was becoming increasingly artificial because public political life had narrowed and real oratory had fewer outlets. In spite of the theatrical training, Spanish writers can sometimes compress a whole judgment into a single line, with a force that others would spread across a paragraph. A remark about Caesar's unstoppable drive, or a perfectly balanced sentence that captures a leader's strength and moral failure at once, shows a knack for striking the core of an issue without long explanation. That gift reaches one of its purest forms in the epigram, where a single sentence must carry the weight of an entire scene. Alongside this vividness sits a second tendency that can weaken the overall effect. A fascination with minute detail, especially in darker material. Minor episodes can be overworked. Descriptions can dwell too long on the physical surface of horror. Pathos can become exaggerated and start to feel unreal, as if the writer is working harder to create emotion than the situation itself requires. This is not limited to one genre. Tragedy lingers on self-mutilation and ritual cruelty. Epic poetry pauses to inventory the battlefield after the fighting has ended. Moral writing can become almost obsessed with the body's suffering. There are writers who expose the depths of Roman social corruption with frightening clarity, and others who describe the torments of Christian martyrs so intensely that the reader's attention is pulled away from the inner strength and the cause itself. The same impulse that creates cinematic vividness can also produce a kind of overlit cruelty, where the eye is forced to stare longer than it needs to. Education provides the infrastructure behind this entire scene. The earliest formal experiment remembered in the sources is a school established at Osca during the Sertorian period. But the deeper story is broader. Greek colonies had already brought access to Greek language and thought, and Greek teachers could be found when towns had the money to hire them. Greek grammarians and rhetoricians appear in the record across southern Spain, and they were not rare curiosities. A teacher could spend a lifetime instructing students in Greek learning and be commemorated in the city where he taught. Greek rhetorical specialists appear in port towns where trade kept the cultural door open. Private tutors, often enslaved or freed and frequently Greek, taught children inside households. Most towns had teachers of literature, and the larger towns supported rhetoricians who trained future advocates. Philosophical instruction existed too, though it often travelled under the broader umbrella of rhetoric. Teachers mainly lived from student fees, and occasionally a municipality paid a salary to keep a public instructor in place. The imperial government did not lead this system. Learning in Spain expanded because local society was willing to use it once it was available. The everyday Latin found on non-official inscriptions is often competent, which suggests that the educational habit had sunk into ordinary civic life. Even the scattered remains of a schoolroom can hint at the curriculum. A tile scratched with the opening lines of a famous epic, likely the model for a writing exercise, brings a classroom moment back to life in a single object. Cordoba stands out as one of the earliest and most influential centres in this literary landscape. Latin poets appear there already in the late Republican period. A figure such as Porcius Latro becomes a symbol of the new scholastic rhetoric. Rhetoric trained not in the rough pressure of political assemblies, but in controlled exercises, staged cases, and public declamation. He leaves Spain for Rome early in Augustus's reign and becomes a celebrated teacher, whose students include major poets. Listeners are said to have sat in silence simply to hear him, instead of practicing their own speeches, which hints at how star-like a rhetorician could become. Yet the same man, brilliant in performance, can fail in real litigation. When asked to plead an actual case back in a Spanish court, he collapses so completely that the judge, out of respect for his reputation, agrees to move the proceedings into the rhetorician's familiar environment, as if reality had to be reshaped to fit the training. Around him appear other Cordoban speakers who influence taste at Rome itself, including figures who push back against the growing inflation of style and try to keep the craft anchored to clarity and proportion. Spanish-born intellectuals also move into Roman cultural administration. A freedman scholar, rising under Augustus, can be placed at the head of a major library and produce works of biography, history, and genealogy. Later texts that circulate under his name show how easily authorship could blur across generations, with reputations being reused or expanded long after the original figure had died. At the centre of this story stands the elder Seneca, born into a wealthy equestrian family at Cordoba in the late Republic. His early education begins at home, and the civil wars complicate the usual path that would have taken a young man to Rome sooner. When he finally arrives in the capital after Cicero's death, he enters a world where rhetorical performance has become the main highway of higher education. He is not best understood as a professional teacher earning fees, but as a man of means who devotes himself to observing the craft, listening to speakers, comparing styles, judging methods, and collecting what he hears. He spends years back in Cordoba, marries into high status, and raises 3 sons who all become notable in different ways. Eventually he returns to Rome, listens to famous orators, already old by then, and later addresses to his sons a series of recollections that preserve the rhetorical culture of previous decades. He also writes a historical work that is now lost, covering the era from the outbreak of civil war, a subject that would have mattered deeply to someone watching public speech shrink under the empire. He dies before the exile that later strikes his philosopher son. The elder Seneca's personality comes through most clearly in the framing sections of his work, where he steps out from behind quotation and summary. The tone is plain and direct, closer to private letters than to the ornamental public style of the early empire. There is an old-fashioned gravity in his judgments, the attitude of a man who admires republican virtues and is not impressed by glossy display. He condemns moral corruption and the degradation he sees in society, including changes in public behaviour that he treats as symptoms of deeper decay. He laments the weakening of free speech and the punishment of thought through state action, including the official destruction of writings that displease those in power. Greek rhetoricians and the cultural fashions associated with them are criticised too, not from ignorance, but from a belief that imported cleverness can accelerate decline. His greatest value is practical. He shows how rhetorical training functioned as the core of elite education under Augustus and Tiberius. With an unusually strong memory and a disciplined sense of method, he aims to map how professional speakers argued their cases over roughly 60 years. Two major categories organise his preserved material. One deals with advisory problems framed around historical or mythological figures, where a speaker must argue what should be done in a moment of choice. Another deals with complex legal disputes, where arguments can be built on both sides. The themes are often artificial, the sort of cases that would never arise in ordinary life. Many are deliberately unpleasant, as if the schoolroom craved extremes, yet they are also safely apolitical, designed to avoid the danger of confronting the government too directly. Sometimes only outlines survive, with no attribution to particular speakers. The reports are not verbatim transcripts, but the range of styles still suggests that he is not simply inventing everything. Collections of declamations existed and could be drawn upon, and later, compilations show echoes and overlaps that hint at a shared tradition. The quoted language is frequently sharp and epigrammatic, shaped for effect, the kind of phrasing that later influences both Lucan's epic and the tragedies associated with the younger Seneca. Yet the elder Seneca's own digressions and judgments often rise above the classroom material, providing a sober commentary on an age that trained brilliance while narrowing truth. His most famous son, the philosopher Seneca, is born at Cordoba as well, but belongs more to Rome than to Spain. He comes to the capital early and appears to have little direct contact with his birthplace afterward. References to Spain are rare and often tied to exile, when memory sharpens. In one work addressed to his mother, he compares Corsican language and dress to those of certain Spanish tribes. In another set of verses associated with that period, he imagines Cordoba mourning for its poet, stranded on a harsh rock. But his life unfolds inside Roman politics and Roman intellectual life. He becomes a moderate Stoic, avoiding the most extreme paradoxes of that school. And he is not a pedant. He writes with a talent for pointed phrasing and vivid anecdote, qualities that make his philosophy accessible and memorable. He is not a creator of new systems, and he is not a deep metaphysician. Yet, his moral voice carries a genuine religious intensity that is rare in ancient ethical writing. The ideals he describes do not lean on the traditional Roman pantheon. They point toward a more inward conception of the divine and of conscience, an attitude that also resonates with the spiritual seriousness spreading in the Western world through Stoicism and other Eastern-influenced currents. In youth, he is drawn toward ascetic habits associated with Pythagorean discipline. Later, accusations of wealth cling to his name, and his own era makes it difficult for any public figure to remain untainted by suspicion. Yet his writings often feel like the work of someone seeking relief from corruption through study, control of the self, and the cultivation of reason. A search sharpened by chronic ill health. His prose, like much of his time, bears the mark of rhetorical training. There is a constant drive to make a point strike, to twist familiar words into unexpected contexts, to hammer a single idea through repeated phrasing that shifts slightly each time. Critics compare this to a performer juggling the same stones in endless new patterns. Beyond the moral treatises and letters, he composes works on natural phenomena drawn largely from Stoic sources, including a major thinker known for blending philosophy with science. These books become influential in later centuries because they offer the ancient world's most readable attempts to explain nature in a moralized frame. He also produces a fierce satire aimed at the emperor who once exiled him, written in a mixed style of prose and verse, a work that uses exaggeration and ridicule with sharp precision. It has the bite of epigram and the wild energy of older comic traditions. The tragedies transmitted under his name contribute less to his philosophical reputation, yet they shape European drama for centuries. Their plots are borrowed from Greek models, their language carries echoes of Latin love poetry, and the emotional temperature is relentlessly high. Characters blur into a shared frenzy as if the entire world is stuck at the same boiling point. Gods of the underworld are invoked constantly. Horror piles on horror, and the language strains to express feelings that seem too large to be real. Still, the workmanship is undeniable. The structure is polished, the lines are clever, and the overall form becomes a template for later classical dramatists in France and Italy, who find in these plays a model for rhetoric-driven tragedy. Lucan, the grandson of the elder Seneca, belongs to the next stage of the movement. He too is born at Cordoba, but is taken to Rome almost immediately, and spends his short life between Italy and Greece. He dies at 25 by his own hand, leaving behind an unfinished epic and fragments of other poetry, the ruins of a much larger ambition. His background pulls him toward senatorial nostalgia. Corduba had suffered in civil conflict, and the family's sympathies align with the remnants of the old elite, carrying resentment toward the new order. His epic is therefore haunted by grief for a republican system that was already failing before it fell, and by anger at the violence and instability that followed. Living at Rome, he witnesses the worst forms of personal rule, and the tension grows sharper when the emperor's jealousy blocks him from public performance. Surrounded by wealth and honour, yet constrained by the court's moods, Lucan pours his skill into an epic that often reads like a series of brilliant speeches arranged in narrative form. The poem lacks what traditional epic usually provides. There is no steady plotline pulling the reader forward, no single heroic centre of gravity, no finished ending to release the accumulated tension. Yet, it is an astonishing act of talent under pressure, the product of real genius accelerated by rhetorical schooling into premature richness. Ancient critics say it is better suited to be imitated by orators than by poets, and that judgment captures something essential about it. The poem excels in aphorisms and weighty single lines that compress an argument into a memorable blow. It shifts quickly from emotion to anger, from scenic description to scientific aside, from narrative into a kind of public lecturing voice. For its time, it handles geography and astronomy with confidence, likely drawn from manuals but used skillfully. Yet the language of poetry was already overworked in that age, and the demand to sound new forces Lucan into strained paraphrase, heightened exaggeration, and a deliberate search for unfamiliar turns of phrase. At its best, the poem paints scenes with startling force, selecting the picturesque detail that makes an image stick. At its worst, it drowns itself in lists, catalogues, and badly timed enumerations of atrocities. The spiritual atmosphere of the epic is equally revealing. Traditional divine machinery is avoided. The gods do not descend to settle battles. The dominant mood is fatalism, with destiny and necessity pressing down on human action. Superstitions and omens appear not as sincere theology but as dramatic tools, and some of the most memorable episodes are built around them. A visit to an oracle, and the scene of necromancy involving a terrifying witch push the poem into a dark, visionary register. Under the influence of wider Eastern religious currents, familiar underworld figures are transformed into something far more savage than their Greek counterparts, and the horror becomes almost ritualistic, as if the poem is opening a doorway to a different kind of sacred fear. This is where Lucan's rhetorical training becomes most dangerous and most effective. It can turn dread into spectacle, with an intensity that later readers struggle to forget. His greatest strength remains the sententious line, the compact statement that ends a long passage by delivering its meaning like a verdict. Such lines have a clean, pointed force that suggests how naturally his gift could have flowed into shorter forms such as epigram if it had been freed from the obligations of epic. Technically, his verse is correct, but it becomes formal and predictable. The flexible rhythm and subtle variety of earlier epic give way to a smoother, recital-friendly hexameter with fixed pauses, minimal elision, and a sound designed to win applause in a reading hall. This is the kind of line that will dominate later satire and later epic, effective in performance but less alive on the page. As a poet of Spain, he offers little direct local colour. Each book shifts to a new landscape, and when the poem reaches the Spanish campaign near Ilerda, the description feels informed by historical narratives rather than by personal familiarity. A flood, the misery of troops separated from water while staring at it, the cruel irony of geography, all are painted vividly, yet the region is more a stage than a homeland. Alongside these major literary figures appear Spanish authors who move into other fields. Pomponius Mela produces a geographical handbook around the middle of the 1st century. He presents himself as coming from a coastal settlement connected to Phoenician movement across the straits, a background that fits his strong interest in shores and sea routes. His descriptions are brief and coastal focused, and his language is coloured by the rhetorical habits of his time. He sometimes forces grammar into sharp effects, building epigrammatic phrases rather than calm explanation. And he even complains about how little room geography gives for eloquence, a revealing complaint for someone trained to make every subject sound like a speech. Later, writers use his work as a convenient summary. For regions better known to Romans, it can be broadly accurate, and it shows small advances over earlier authorities in certain points, such as a clearer understanding of mountain ranges and coastlines. Yet, it remains a compendium rather than a measured scientific survey. Distances are largely ignored. Old ethnographic tales are repeated. Fantastic creatures and remote myths are inserted alongside genuine coastal detail. Not because the author believes them all, but because such wonders were part of what readers expected from a tour of the edges of the world. Columella represents another path. Born at Gades during Augustus's reign and raised by a grandfather skilled in practical farming, he carries provincial knowledge into a Roman tone that feels almost conservative. He serves in Syria as a military officer, then settles in Italy and manages estates near Rome. He knows leading intellectual figures of the age, yet his language avoids many fashionable distortions, partly because the subject itself anchors him. A manual on agriculture cannot survive on verbal fireworks alone. He reads earlier agricultural writers, absorbs history and philosophy, and allows older Latin echoes to colour his prose without turning it into imitation. The voice sounds like that of a Roman of the old stamp, even though the author is provincially born. He complains about the dishonesty of lawyers, the humiliations of client dependents, and the way urban life with its spectacles seduces citizens away from the hard competence of vineyards and fields. His work moves steadily through the full range of farming activity. How to choose land, how to handle trees, herds, birds, animal parks, and the management responsibilities of the farmer's household. One section on gardening is written in verse as a respectful nod to an earlier poetic model, and the author is modest about the result. The poetry is serviceable rather than dazzling. The overall viewpoint remains practical. The countryside is not treated as a landscape for aesthetic worship, but as a living system that rewards attention, discipline, and skill. The first figures in this story came from the sunlit south, where Roman ways had taken root earliest. But the last two major voices produced during Spain's brief moment of literary dominance came from farther north, from the rougher districts of the Hither province. That shift matters. It shows Roman culture spreading beyond the richest coastal and river valleys, reaching towns that had once been known less for polished speech than for stubborn resistance. One of those northern voices was Quintilian. He was born at Calagoris, a small Iberian town on the upper Ebro. The place had an intense reputation. During the final phase of the Sertorian revolt, it held out longer than almost anyone, pushing resistance to desperate extremes before surrendering to Rome. In time, the town received municipal status, and by the middle of the 1st century, its most famous son was on his way to the capital. Quintilian, born around the middle of the 1st century, was taken to Rome while still young by his father, who taught rhetoric there. That early move placed him in the presence of the best-known speakers and teachers of the age. He listened, absorbed, watched how reputations were made, and learned the difference between a clever performance and a truly persuasive mind at work. For a short period he returned home, practicing law and teaching in his own region. That local career, however, did not remain local for long. Galba, then commanding in the Tarraconensian province, noticed his talent. When Galba later marched toward imperial power, Quintilian travelled with him to Rome, and from that point his rise was steady. He became a celebrated advocate, so prominent that one of his speeches was delivered on behalf of Berenice, the Jewish queen whose presence at Rome attracted both fascination and gossip. Under Vespasian, he received something unprecedented: a state-funded appointment as an official teacher of rhetoric, the first of its kind. After roughly a decade, he withdrew from public teaching and later enjoyed further honours under Domitian, including ceremonial consular distinction and the role of tutor to members of the imperial household. The praise he offered the emperor in return was not always deserved, but it reflects the reality of survival at court. In his later years, he poured his energy into the work that still defines him, a full guide to shaping an orator from childhood to maturity, not only as a speaker, but as a disciplined mind and an upright person. For about 20 years, Quintilian functioned as Rome's leading authority on education and taste, even allowing for the exaggerations that cling to reputations. His influence seems to have been real. The next generation at Rome shows a cleaner, more restrained sensibility in public writing, and it is not unreasonable to see Quintilian's imprint in that shift. Major figures of the late 1st and early 2nd centuries lived under the cultural climate he helped set. Even a satirist who takes pleasure in exposing hypocrisy and decay can point to Quintilian as an example of severe integrity in a filthy age. That detail says much. In a society quick to praise flatterers and reward spectacle, Quintilian's public image remained associated with seriousness, discipline, and a kind of moral firmness. His stated mission was clear: to rescue the art of speaking from a swamp of habits that had grown fashionable and corrosive. Rhetorical handbooks, written in the decades after the elder Seneca, often multiplied defects rather than correcting them. They could be intricate, technical, and full of hair-splitting, yet strangely useless, when applied to real persuasion and real judgment. Quintilian's corrective begins with a principle that sounds almost simple. The ideal speaker must first be a good person. The orator should not knowingly defend what is unjust. He should be trained not only in technique, but in the best literature available, Greek and Latin alike. And above all, he should measure himself against Cicero's standard of clarity, balance, and force. Quintilian's own prose supports that program. It is not free of the period's habits, but it remains unusually clean for the so-called Silver Age. Nothing in his writing announces a provincial origin. When he cites a word that sounds regional, he distances himself from it, noting that it is merely reported to belong to Spain. The remark is small, but revealing. He is conscious of accent, conscious of reputation, and determined to stand on the purest ground he can claim. After Quintilian, Spain still produced gifted men at Rome, but the era's centre of gravity was shifting. Taste does not remain fixed, and public attention moves on. A Spanish-born figure named Antonius Julianus gained praise for eloquence and wide reading in older literature, and for a time his reputation helped fill the role of cultural referee. Another Spaniard, Voconius Romanus from Valentia, was admired for letters so elegant that a reader could imagine the muses themselves speaking Latin. These compliments, repeated in elite circles, acted like lanterns to ambitious young provincials. Spain sent more hopefuls toward Rome, dreaming that talent alone could unlock wealth and status. Reality was colder. Many arrived only to learn how thin the rewards could be. The client system offered tiny handouts, humiliations dressed as patronage. One Spanish newcomer turned back after reaching the Milvian Bridge, disgusted by how paltry the client's life appeared when compared with the hopes that had carried him across the sea. Those who failed to secure a stable position often fell into dependence, living by wit, flattery, and improvisation. Rome did not lack opportunities, but it demanded a price: time, pride, and sometimes character. No one illustrates that bargain better than Martial, born at Bilbilis near Emerita Augusta. In him, Spain produced a writer of remarkable sharpness and genuine poetic gift, yet the city's social machinery still held him down. Martial moved within a circle of poets that included several compatriots. One of the most popular was Canius Rufus of Gades, a lively storyteller with a reputation for endless good spirits. Martial praises him in a way that makes the comparison vivid. Ulysses might escape the sirens, but abandoning a companion like Canius would be the real surprise. Other Spanish figures appear around the edges of Martial's world. A poet and Stoic scholar from Emmerita, an orator of equestrian rank, who grew wealthy and began to forget old friendships, lawyers with solid reputations, and another Bilbilitan poet, encouraged to celebrate his homeland, famous for iron and for the river, whose waters were said to harden steel. The details matter because they show a provincial network inside the capital, a chain of acquaintance that could offer support or vanish the moment success arrived. Martial's epigrams range widely. Some carry real tenderness, often circling around death with a seriousness that ancient observers repeatedly associated with Spain. Others are light social verses designed for quick laughter and quick forgetting. Others strike with a satiric edge, that biting humour which later Spanish writing would also display in different ages and different forms. Martial himself is often coarse and willing to bow to power, and there is no need to soften that. Yet his work repeatedly betrays an awareness of the emptiness of the life he is forced to live. The artificiality of Rome, the relentless performance, the hunger for attention, the humiliations of dependence. These themes surface again and again. Behind the jokes sits a wish to breathe, to escape the city's poisoned air, to recover a simpler rhythm of life, even if that recovery cannot be complete. After more than 30 years in Rome, that strain finally wins. Martial returns to Bilbilis and, through the generosity of a wealthy admirer named Marcella, receives a small estate that allows him to live independently for the few years he has left. Yet the return is not pure comfort. He feels the dullness of provincial life, the lack of sharp conversation, the replacement of criticism with petty resentment. He realizes something painful. Epigrams are not produced in a vacuum. They depend on an audience, on theatres, libraries, public gatherings, and the electric current of city life. Remove the crowd and the poet's instrument dulls. Still, pride in his hometown remains, and with it affection for rural festivals, dances, rose-covered arbours, and the oak groves where local worship continued in old forms. The rhythms of daily life slow into something almost pastoral. Clothing lasts because it is rarely needed in formal settings. The names of nearby places sound too harsh to sit comfortably in polished Latin verse. Mornings stretch. A late wake becomes normal. The bailiff is watched as he distributes rations to labourers. A household fire is fed with oak logs from the grove. The shade of vines offers a cool ceiling even in winter. The estate includes small pleasures, fountains, a dovecote, a pond stocked with eels. The irony is striking. The poet of Rome's sharpest social world shows one of the most sensitive appreciations of countryside sound and light. As if the constant ugliness of the city trained him to recognize quiet beauty the moment it appeared. This contrast raised a broader question about Spain itself during the early empire. How can a land once described through images of brigands, cave dwellers, and brutal customs seem, for a brief period, to produce rhetoricians, philosophers, and poets whose work circulates at Rome? And how can the later centuries appear to drift toward credulity and superstition, toward violent zeal, toward a religious imagination filled with wonders and miracles? The shift looks dramatic, almost like a collapse from reason into frenzy. Yet the explanation may be less mysterious than it seems. Misgovernment and economic decline reduced the vitality of urban life. Trade weakened. Towns that had supported schools and libraries lost momentum. At the same time, a growing wave of Eastern religious feeling in the wider empire encouraged trust in revelation, intuition, and sacred wonder at the expense of strict rationality. But the deepest factor may be demographic and social. Spain was not primarily a land of huge cities. The typical community was the small village, an agricultural or mining settlement with a few hundred inhabitants. Such places often lacked full municipal institutions. Rome handled them by attaching them administratively to larger centres. In practice, that could mean long stretches of local self-management, interrupted mainly by tax demands. No literature teacher would build a school there. No elegant inscriptions would survive to show how pure the Latin had become. While a cosmopolitan crowd in Tarraco cheered racing factions and Emmerita staged elaborate water spectacles, villagers were content with hunting, rustic dancing, and contests of strength such as javelin throwing. Imperial rule might feel as distant as a foreign empire governing a remote village at the edge of a map. A story preserved from that world captures the gap. When orders arrived that there should be public celebrations for an imperial victory in Greek games, the villagers obeyed. Yet the only impression that remained was confusion. They believed the emperor had defeated a people called the Olympians. The command had been carried out, but the meaning had not travelled with it. That is the distance between the educated urban minority and the rural majority. As towns declined, that rural class, always numerically dominant and in many ways the real weight of the population, came more strongly to the front. The literary culture of the early empire, brilliant as it was, had never been the voice of the majority. In that sense, the later explosion of popular legends, miracle stories, and saintly biographies can be seen not only as degeneration but also as expression, material created among the people and for the people, satisfying a hunger for the marvelous and translating faith into images and events that could be remembered and retold. Against this background, the spread of Christianity in Spain becomes easier to picture. It likely entered first through Jewish communities in coastal trading towns, though the beginnings of those communities remain uncertain. Medieval imagination later created stories of extremely ancient Hebrew settlements, partly to remove blame from Jewish ancestors for the crucifixion. Those legends cannot be trusted, yet it is not impossible that Jewish merchants speaking a language and possessing commercial habits compatible with other Eastern traders joined early movements along the southern coast. What is clearer is that by the early imperial centuries, Jews were firmly established. Prisoners were settled in Spain under certain emperors. Coins and scattered finds point to Jewish presence in major cities. Spain appears in later Jewish tradition, though such references cannot always be dated with confidence. The earliest physical monument often cited is the grave of an infant Jewish girl at Abdera, and it belongs to a relatively late period, not earlier than the 3rd century. By the early 4th century, Jewish communities were numerous enough to draw the attention of a major church council held at Iberis. The council's rules show what everyday contact looked like. Intermarriage was forbidden, and even eating with Jews or sharing domestic space was discouraged. The blessing of crops associated with Jewish fields was condemned, a sign of how intertwined rural life could be despite official warnings. Under Constantine, converting a Christian to Judaism became a penal offence. Yet systematic persecution did not become a defining feature until later, especially under Visigothic rule. Early Christian tradition also insists that Paul carried out his plan to visit Spain. 2 ancient witnesses say he did, yet the details are fog. Where he landed, how long he stayed, which towns he reached, none of that can be stated with certainty. Later, legend fills the gaps with a vivid itinerary, imagining him moving through the south and along the coast. The same tradition continues with a dramatic sequel. A group of bishops is said to have been sent from Rome to plant organized churches across southern Spain, led by a figure named Torquatus. Miracles are attached to their journey, including stories of bridges collapsing at the moment of their arrival during pagan festivals. A narrative pattern meant to show divine power breaking into public life. One town in particular claimed primacy as the first episcopal seat in Spain, building prestige on the idea of apostolic beginnings. Whatever the truth of those legends, Christianity had certainly taken root in Baetica by the early 2nd century. Claims about persecutions under Domitian are often treated as unreliable, but by the time late 2nd century Christian writers survey the world, they speak as if Spain already knows the Christian name. More concrete documents appear in the mid-3rd century. A key letter from Cyprian, written to congregations in northern and western districts, shows that bishops already existed not only in the larger eastern centres, but also in places such as Leon, Asturica, and Emerita. It also reveals how fragile leadership could be under pressure. Some bishops had lapsed during the persecution under Decius, the first major wave to touch Spain with real severity. Another set of evidence comes from martyr narratives, especially the account of Fructuosus, Bishop of Tarraco, executed by burning together with his deacons for refusing to participate in state cult. Fructuosus is the only Spanish bishop clearly known to have died as a martyr under Roman rule, and that detail alone suggests that Spain's Christian communities were growing, yet still unevenly targeted compared with other regions. The pattern of leadership in Tarraco itself hints at how violence could interrupt continuity. After Fructuosus, the record falls silent for a long time, likely because later barbarian incursions and local crises shattered the stability that a bishopric required. Whether other bishops preceded him remains uncertain, though the size of the city makes it plausible. After the worst pressure passed, a surprising reversal helped the churches. The persecuting emperor Valerian died in humiliation as a captive among the Persians, and his successor, Gallienus, overwhelmed by internal threats, withdrew the harsh measures and allowed Christians to use their burial grounds and meeting places without interference. For roughly a generation, the church could organize in relative peace. Leadership strengthened. Councils became possible. Writers around the year 300 could speak as if Christians were numerous in Spain as well as in Gaul. Even then, numbers should not be exaggerated. In the earliest phase, a bishop did not necessarily mean a vast crowd. The bishop functioned much like the head of a single community, assisted by deacons and supported through regular contributions. Services could take place in private houses, and only toward the end of the 3rd century did purpose-built churches become more common. Later, imperial policies that transferred pagan temple buildings to Christian use, whether for convenience or symbolism, helped preserve fragments of ancient architecture by giving old walls a new function. The final and fiercest test came under Diocletian and Maximian. The machinery unfolded in stages. Early measures targeted soldiers who refused required rites. Later, edicts hardened into broader repression. Clergy were imprisoned, release was offered in exchange for sacrifice, and eventually death was prescribed for those who refused. In Spain, officials arrived to enforce the policy across the major towns. One governor in particular is portrayed in the martyr accounts as travelling through the province, extracting confessions and staging executions. The list of victims stretches across the map. Girona, Barcelona, Caesar Augusta, Complutum, Toledo, Valencia, Emerita, Astigi, and districts connected with Gades. The persecution was intense but relatively brief, lasting roughly a year because political changes at the top disrupted enforcement. Its main effect was not to crush the churches, but to weld them into a stronger, more unified body. After a series of disasters struck their persecutors and imperial politics shifted, Christians gained leverage. They could support the contender for power, who promised toleration, and over time the alliance would reshape the empire. When the danger passed, a different challenge arrived. Regulation. The church had to define how Christians should live among pagan neighbours, how far compromise could go, and which professions and civic duties were compatible with the new identity. A council met at Iliberis around the early 4th century under the presidency of a leading bishop. Its decisions reveal a careful balance. Reckless seeking of martyrdom was discouraged, and those executed for smashing idols were not to be honoured as martyrs. Christians who held civic office tied to pagan ritual were restricted from church participation until their term ended. Entering temples was forbidden, as were marriages binding Christian families to pagan or Jewish households. Public games and sacrificial duties were treated as dangerous compromises. Images were banned from churches, suggesting fear that idolatry could return in a new form, with sacred pictures taking the place of old statues. Entertainers closely linked to public spectacle were excluded unless they abandoned their profession. Clergy were told to avoid commerce and to live in sexual abstinence, a rule contested elsewhere, yet repeatedly reaffirmed in parts of Spain. In the centuries after Christianity became a public force in Spain, the church's story often reads like a long fight on two fronts. One enemy stood outside, in the form of rival teachings that spread quickly and built real followings. Another threat grew inside, as old habits and older religious instincts quietly returned under new names. In the north, movements linked to Gnosticism gained strength early, offering a version of Christianity shaped by secret knowledge, cosmic dualism, and spiritual hierarchies. Later, Arianism created an even larger storm, not only because it challenged central doctrine, but because it blended Christian language with ideas that still felt close to the religious world of late antiquity. Both challenges were resisted and ultimately contained. Yet victory brought its own consequences. Across time, Christian worship began to absorb the atmosphere of the old mystery cults. Rituals grew more elaborate, sacred spaces filled with images, stories of holy figures multiplied, shrines became destinations. Pilgrimages to martyrs' graves and sanctuaries became common, and the memory of the dead was not simply honoured, but increasingly treated as a source of protection, power, and intercession. With that shift came another: the rise of a more worldly church leadership in some places. Wealth, influence, and public status created temptations that were hard to refuse. Ambition and self-interest did not disappear simply because new beliefs had triumphed. The reaction began quietly, first through solitary religious devotees who stepped outside society's noise, and later through organized monastic life. Two opposing forces emerged in the same landscape. On one side stood a desire for visible beauty and sacred drama, the love of ceremony, brilliance, relics, and the celebration of revered heroes of the faith. On the other side stood an older Iberian instinct for austerity, self-denial, and moral intensity. A hard-edged sense that inner discipline mattered more than public splendor. This tension never truly disappeared. It can be felt again and again in later Spanish religious history, in the fierce energy of reformers and founders, and in the recurring urge to strip faith down to its most demanding essentials. At the same time, the old Roman tendency to pull everything toward a single centre began to weaken. Provinces started to develop clearer local identities. Differences appeared not only in theological debates, but even in everyday details such as the style and wording of tomb inscriptions. Spain's early Christian literature is sparse before the mid-4th century, yet the country absorbed influences from outside with remarkable force. The writings of North African church fathers left a deep mark, not so much in Africa itself, where civil chaos and invasions often shattered continuity, but in Spain, where those works were read and studied for generations. Later, Spanish writers built directly on this inheritance. One studied Cyprian closely. Another devoted himself to Augustine. From roughly the early 4th century until the Arab conquest, Christian authors appear steadily. Only a few rise to the level of real genius, but the wider stream suggests something important. Education remained strong, the Latin of these writers stayed relatively clean, and intellectual standards did not collapse as easily as popular stereotypes imply. One of the earliest notable Christian poets in Spain was Juvencus, a priest living in the age of Constantine. He produced a long poetic retelling of the Gospels in the classical hexameter line. The narrative leans most heavily on Matthew, and it shows at least some awareness of Greek, though the main foundation comes from Latin Gospel traditions. In style, the debt to Virgil is unmistakable, and other major poets appear in the background as well. The approach stays close to the Gospel story, so there is little direct, personal commentary. Even so, the work reveals a fascinating blend of religious urgency and classical confidence. A vision of final cosmic fire appears, yet alongside that is an almost proud belief that poetry gives endurance, that the names praised by poets outlive ordinary mortality, and that the poet himself might somehow be remembered as long as the world remains. The verse is not always technically perfect. The grammar sometimes slips into older forms or popular constructions. Yet overall, the style stays plain and usable, suited to telling a sacred story without drowning it in ornament. Spain also produced a pope of real historical weight, long before the Renaissance age, Damasus, who lived in the 4th century. His rise to power was tied to brutal violence, and his career shows how fierce Christian politics could become once the church held public authority. Alongside church leadership, he wrote works of a historical and reflective kind, and composed short, elegant poems on biblical themes that still survive. This combination of sacred authority, literary ambition, and ruthless conflict captures the era's contradictions in a single life. The towering poetic figure of this Spanish Christian age is Prudentius. Born before the middle of the 4th century, likely in the northeastern zone and familiar with that region's history, he began life in a secular career. He worked as a lawyer, then held high administrative posts under Theodosius, even serving twice as governor in major cities. Only later does he seem to have moved toward a more explicitly religious life. Yet his writing has the voice of a devout and broadly educated layman, rather than a technical theologian. His surviving poems are numerous, and they became enormously popular in the medieval world. By his time, Christianity had won political security, and the old fear of sounding too classical had faded. Prudentius freely borrowed from earlier poets. He knew Virgil and Horace deeply, and used their rhythms and phrases without embarrassment. Greek literature mattered far less to him than Latin tradition and Latin Christian writers. What sets him apart from many religious authors of the period is a certain openness toward the empire and even toward the higher achievements of pagan civilization. He condemns the gladiatorial games and ridicules empty philosophical pretension. Yet he also admires ancient art and criticizes the blind destruction of statues and monuments. A quiet hope appears in his work that Roman order, joined to the church, could still bring stability, while paganism might be pushed to the margins where barbarian peoples still held sway. In his vision, Rome's historical growth had served a deeper purpose. It created the roads and shared structures through which the gospel could spread, even if pagans claimed that expansion as the gift of their gods. From a literary perspective, some of his strongest writing appears in long poems that confront pagan arguments head-on, using a fluent and relatively classical style. Another major group consists of hymns, sometimes theological, often emotional, and at moments genuinely graceful. Several of these hymns entered later Christian tradition through translation and became staples of worship. Prudentius also wrote against Western heresies that continued to circulate in different forms, treating them as intellectual and spiritual dangers, rather than simply political enemies. His most famous set of poems, however, helped shape something that became intensely Spanish: devotion to martyrs. These pieces were widely read, especially in Spain, and they strengthened the cult surrounding heroic victims of persecution. Their artistic quality is uneven. The language can be swollen and repetitive. The pacing can drag. Worst of all, the descriptions of torture are sometimes so detailed that they become almost unbearable, lingering on physical pain with a realism that overwhelms quieter virtues. Yet this harsh intensity fit the emotional climate of the region. It matched a cultural taste for strong, unflinching images and for heroic endurance in the face of death. At the same time, these poems preserve valuable glimpses of late, antique religious life, including information about blood ritual practices in certain pagan cults that are rarely described in such detail elsewhere. Many of the martyrs celebrated are Spanish figures, linked to cities along the Mediterranean and deep into the interior. Shrines appear as richly decorated spaces. The habit of adorning churches with painted scenes from sacred history begins to stand out more clearly. The visual world of Christianity is coming alive, and with it the temptation to treat images not as reminders, but as objects of devotion in their own right. For all his classical training, Prudentius also looks forward toward medieval imagination. Religion is given romantic intensity. Nature is invited to participate in the sacred drama as if the earth itself responds to divine events. Pilgrims travel to a martyr's shrine believing that the saint can hear them and that comfort will follow. A poem that stages virtues and vices as battling characters anticipates later moral dramas and theatrical traditions that would survive in Spain for centuries. Even his habit of writing separate poems, glorifying individual endurance, connects to the later taste for heroic narrative that would become central in Spanish storytelling and memory. In the same century, another figure appears who represents the opposite pole. Priscilian, a bishop remembered less for poetry than for tragedy. His importance lies in a grim milestone. He became the first known example of a Christian being executed by a Christian government for heresy. The story carries a bitter irony. The violence once suffered from outside now turns inward. Priscilian began as a layman from the northwest, wealthy yet austere, learned, eloquent, devoted to fasting and vigils. Influences linked to Gnostic teachers were alleged against him, and those teachers were said to carry ideas that reached Spain from the eastern Mediterranean. Whether these accusations were fair mattered less than the fear he inspired. He gathered followers among elites and common people alike, including many women. Church leaders panicked. A council condemned the movement even before Priscilian himself could properly answer. Then, his supporters elevated him to the episcopacy, and he set out with companions to seek recognition and protection from higher authority. In Rome, he found a closed door. The Pope refused even to receive the group. In northern Italy, they achieved more, and political manoeuvring followed. An imperial edict was obtained ordering their restoration to their positions. That success only inflamed opponents. When a usurper seized power in Gaul, the situation darkened. Councils condemned Priscilian and his allies. Eventually, in the mid-380s, he and several companions were executed by beheading in the imperial north, including a wealthy woman who had joined the movement during its spread through Gaul. The motives of the ruler who approved the killings were not primarily theological. Money and power were central. Confiscations enriched the regime. The favour of the Spanish church was purchased through cruelty. Plans were even floated to send officials into Spain to hunt suspected heretics by appearance, as if holiness could be detected by pale faces and sober clothing. A leading saint of the era fought hard against this sort of state interference in church disputes, arguing that doctrine should not be policed by civil executioners. The resistance slowed the campaign, but it could not undo what had already happened. After Priscilian's death, the movement associated with his name spread rather than vanished. In the northwest and across the Aquitaine region, it gained followers, and something even stranger occurred. The executed bishop was revered by many as a martyr. His companions were buried with honour. His name became so powerful that swearing an oath by Priscilian could be treated as the strongest possible pledge. Only decades later did a major council finally secure formal renunciations from remaining adherents. The official charges used to justify the execution focused on magic and immorality, yet evidence suggests that these accusations were largely manufactured for legal effect. For a long time, the only information came from hostile chroniclers. Later discoveries of Priscilian's own writings allow a clearer view. Those texts reject magic and reject Manichaean extremes. They do not prove that he tried to abolish marriage or ban animal food in the crude way enemies claimed. Instead, he looks like an ascetic seeker, intensely focused on revelation, prophecy, spiritual struggle, and inner peace. Not a trained theologian, but a man trying to force clarity out of mystery. Traces of confused doctrine can be detected, views that later creeds explicitly oppose. But such subtleties alone rarely ignite the kind of hatred that produces executions. The deeper cause seems more human. Jealousy and fear inside the church. Priscilian claimed a higher purity, a superior spiritual insight. That kind of authority threatens institutional power, especially when it draws popular devotion. The pattern repeats through history. A preacher with moral charisma is denounced. A ruler with political hunger sees profit. Accusations are chosen for maximum impact. And the prophet falls because he lacks force to defend himself. A similar harshness appears in the treatment of smaller rigid groups, such as those who refuse to readmit former Arians, even after repentance. Their inflexibility echoed older schisms that demanded purity at any cost. What emerges is a religious world under stress. Unity desired, discipline enforced, and mercy sometimes sacrificed to control. In the early 5th century, another Spanish voice offers a different angle on the age's upheaval. Orosius, a priest from the northwest, who travelled widely and knew major thinkers of the Christian world. His universal history is not original in its sources, and it sometimes slips into rhetorical flourishes. But it becomes valuable when it turns toward the writer's own time. A strong national bitterness can be felt in his judgments. The empire's fall does not inspire nostalgic grief. Instead, Rome is accused of brutality and hypocrisy. Spain's suffering under Roman wars and taxation is brought forward as evidence that Roman greatness was built on provincial blood. Old heroic resistance is praised, and the claim is made that life under new Germanic masters can feel freer than life under imperial extraction. Behind the work lies a larger argument. Disasters did not begin with Christianity. The ancient world was full of calamity long before the Church gained power. In this view, the conversion of Rome did not unleash misfortune, but offered meaning in a world that had always been violent. Latin culture continued under Gothic rule, especially in the early 7th century. An intellectual circle formed around an unusually educated king. Churchmen wrote history, theology, grammar, and encyclopedic summaries. The effect of this literary activity was not merely scholarly. It helped keep spoken Latin relatively stable, preventing the Germanic language of the ruling elite from reshaping the emerging Romance speech too quickly. The language that would become Spanish was still forming, and learned Latin acted like a weight holding it in a recognizable shape. Beneath these religious and political currents ran another long story. What happened to Spain's older languages and how Latin replaced them. Knowledge of Iberian relies on inscriptions from the late Republic, on coin legends from many towns, on divine and personal names, and on scattered words preserved in Latin sources. The writing system used in Iberian areas shows connections to Punic models, though not as a simple borrowing, and over time local practice moved toward the standard left-to-right habit. The language itself appears vowel-rich, and in some cases missing vowels on coin legends hint at strong Phoenician influence. Yet the evidence is uneven. Most surviving native inscriptions come from eastern Spain, while dialects of the north and west are mostly known only through names. A major obstacle remains. No bilingual inscription has been found that repeats the same text in both Latin and Iberian, in a way that would unlock full decipherment. Without that key, interpretation stays partial. In Celtic regions, the situation is even more limited. No inscriptions clearly survive from before Latin arrived. Celtic speech has to be reconstructed largely from place names and personal names. Many towns end in elements like Brigga and Dunham, though later, Latinization complicates certainty, and some Celtic-looking names appear outside Celtic settlement zones. Tribal names show recurring endings as well. Ancient writers suggest that Celtic dialects survived into the early empire in some regions, but they seem to have faded relatively early, leaving only small traces on later languages. Those traces appear mostly in pronunciation patterns and a modest number of everyday words. Phoenician speech, despite the fame of the southern colonies, seems to have had surprisingly little long-term impact on Spanish Latin. Outside a few strongholds, Phoenician settlements were mixed with local populations, and Latin was adopted quickly. A handful of place names remained, and some personal names appear in early inscriptions. Phoenician script disappeared from civic use by the age of Augustus, and Punic coin legends ended. Greek influence, by contrast, remained visible across the empire. Greek settlers continued to arrive in commercial centres as doctors, musicians, teachers, and specialists of many kinds. Fully Greek inscriptions are rare early on, but Greek names appear constantly, sometimes declined in unusual ways. Greek loanwords also entered provincial Latin in Spain, including terms related to medicine, religion, and daily life. Through these Greek-speaking networks, heavily Hellenized Eastern cults gained footholds in the peninsula. Latin itself spread early and widely, especially along coasts and in the major cities, helped by colonies and by the extension of legal rights that required Latin for public acts. Yet evidence suggests that Spanish Latin could carry a recognizable accent. Roman observers sometimes described Spanish speech as rough or foreign-sounding. Even skilled rhetoricians could struggle to erase the emphatic, rural tone of their upbringing. In elite settings, an imperfect accent could provoke laughter. At the same time, scattered ancient references imply that native languages lingered longer in remote areas. Some writers mention Iberians, who still use their mother tongue well into the imperial period. Others speak as if interpreters were needed for certain populations. Archaeology adds a partial support. Native coin legends and inscriptions largely disappear by the early empire, which suggests Latin dominance. Yet silence in the record does not prove instant extinction in the countryside. To estimate how long the older dialects survived, and how much they shaped the new Romance speech, two kinds of clues remain. One is the survival of non-Latin words in Latin texts and inscriptions, especially in categories where native expertise was strong. Military terms, horse-related vocabulary, mining terminology, land measures, and a small number of household words. The other is the presence in modern Spanish and Portuguese of words and sound patterns that do not fit cleanly with Latin, Arabic, or later Germanic inputs. Even these clues require caution, because Basque and its relationship to ancient Iberian remain uncertain, and later interaction between Basque and Spanish complicates the picture. Sound changes in Spanish often suggest deep substrate influence. In some native tongues, voiced consonants and voiceless ones were not sharply distinguished, and this kind of confusion shows up in the way certain names were recorded with shifting spellings. Latin words entering everyday speech underwent similar transformations. Some consonants weakened, especially the Latin F, which in many cases softened into a breathy sound and later disappeared from pronunciation. A tendency to insert vowels into difficult consonant clusters appears in both late Latin forms and later Spanish development. Certain consonants drift toward other sounds in predictable patterns, and vowels shift in ways that point to long-standing habits of pronunciation in the peninsula. Reconstructing spoken Latin in Spain is difficult because literary authors provide limited help. Elite writers trained in Rome do not reflect provincial speech. Many later Christian authors used a shared Western church style that smooths away local variations. Inscriptions provide the richest evidence, yet even they can mislead. Many were produced by officials or carved using formulaic patterns copied from models. After the 2nd century, they become fewer and more inflated, offering less of the living voice of ordinary people. Even so, the general impression is that provincial Latin in Spain remained relatively conservative. Latin arrived early when spoken and written forms were still closer than they would later become. It was often learned deliberately as a second language, which slowed some kinds of change. Archaisms persisted in legal and formal contexts, strengthened by early Roman settlement. Vocabulary stayed fairly stable until later centuries. A few odd mistakes and inventive compounds appear, suggesting speakers experimenting with a language not fully mastered. But overall, the shift toward a fully debased register seems late. In the end, the simplest picture is also the most plausible. Iberian and other native languages likely survived longest in rural and remote districts, perhaps even into the final centuries of the empire, while Latin became broadly understood from at least the Flavian period onward. Christianity reinforced Latin's position by tying Spain more tightly to wider Western networks of clergy, texts, and administration. After the Germanic takeovers, Latin remained necessary as a shared tool of communication across mixed populations, while the older native languages gradually faded, probably dying out under Gothic rule. They left relatively little behind in vocabulary, but they likely shaped pronunciation and certain sound habits in the Romance language that was slowly forming, an invisible inheritance carried not in books, but in the way people spoke.